I promised this video for Tuesday and now it's Friday, but I got an excuse, so please let me blame the thief of time. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about Discworld books. It's been a while, hasn't it? Well, months and months and months of me just repeatedly reading Guards while I cry myself to sleep. Well, not truly, but, you know. But this is about book 26 in publication order in our ongoing Discworld read-along. It is The Thief of Time. It's another book featuring Death's granddaughter, and some other people that we've met before. We are sort of, entering almost the home stretch of Discworld publication order. We're getting close, which is sad. But there we are. And as usual, I'll talk about spoiler-free parts in the beginning, and then we'll talk about some themes that are in there, and then we'll end the whole thing. Should you want to join us in our constant, slow reading of Discworld novels and then having conversations about it, well, please do so. Next up that we'll really talk about will be the amazing Maurice and his educated rodents, because I know that The Last Hero is before that in publication order, but it's kind of hard to get for a lot of people because of publication issues, licensing and shit like that. So I'm not sure if we'll talk about The Last Hero in detail, but I'll definitely make a video about it. So there we are. Yeah. You're welcome to join, otherwise enjoy this video and let me know what you think about this book and Discworld in general in the comments. So let's get started. Alright, this is the spoiler-free pitch, why you should read this book. Well, it is a Discworld book featuring Death's granddaughter Susan, so it's part of that sub-series. It also talks about time and the ever-important question of what makes us human. Also, order versus chaos, rules and when to break them, and a lot of jokes about martial arts and martial arts movies. So there you have all of these main themes. It's fun. It is not my favorite Discworld novel. It has some, I don't want to call them flaws. Let's just say that it does feel sometimes a bit like a patchwork of a bunch of ideas that not necessarily fully fit together. In that regard, it reminds me a bit of something like Reaper Man, where you have the same issue. But maybe that's also part of the theme of the novel, where it's also about how to get, bits and pieces to fit together that might not fully fit, and how we can actually overlook that. So let's call it that way. But yeah, as I said, it's a fun story about the end of the world and how to prevent it, or maybe not. And yeah, it's as good a place to start as any other, if you don't mind, having, spoilers for previous books in there, which happen. Also, it does have one huge disadvantage, and that is there is no librarian in this book, which is sad. Beyond that, once again, great book. Go read it. I mean, why are you even here if you're not reading Discworld at this point? Go read it, and then we'll talk about details. Here we are. Let's talk about details. I hope you enjoyed the book. As I said, I enjoy it. It does have some really cool set pieces and jokes, but as I mentioned before, I don't think it comes together as well as some of the other novels in later Discworld. That might just be because of the double structure of 2 or 3 plot lines. As I said, it does remind me of Reaper Man in that regard. But there's a lot of good things here, and I feel that's part of where I want to go with this discussion, and that is Terry Pratchett is asking a huge question here, and he's going closer to it, and he uses a theme that we will see foreshadowing in another book called Wintersmith in the not-so-distant future, and that is what makes a man, or in this case, humans, and so forth. Steel Eye Span have made a wonderful song about it in their album Wintersmith. Go listen to that. I mean, go read the book as well. But it is exactly the question, what makes humans human? Is there some ineffable unexplainable, inexplicable quality to humanity that goes beyond the mere function on the mere mechanics of biology, and that is a key question that Terry Pratchett obviously wrestles with a lot. It ties into what we do with literature in general, which is look at, the human condition and what it is, and trying to explain something that goes beyond, meaning that goes beyond just the sum of the parts, that whole phrase. And there's all kinds of elements where that shows. Art is definitely one, and that's why it shows up in this book when we talk about art and the museum. Humanity, emotions, love is certainly one of those bits that are difficult to explain. Well, also time perception, which is where the other big thing comes in here, which is obviously the plot line around the history monks. History, which is all about like us explaining events and them getting more meaning out of that just by us, interpreting them. All of that. And beyond that lies the eternal question, the eternal conflict that we have seen in so many fantasy books that goes beyond, good and evil, and that is the question between chaos and order. Now, obviously, if you've ever, read Michael Moorcock or Poul Anderson, you've heard about that idea of chaos versus order, and it's something we find out here, and Terry Pratchett is taking a crack at it, and it is very much that ongoing idea of order versus chaos, and there's a change in here compared to an earlier book that I want to highlight. Do you remember the first apocalypse in a Discworld novel? Well, it was in Sorcery when the Ice Giants wrote out. Now, Ice Giants are very much chaos when you look at Norse mythology and all of these ideas. The Ice Giants taking over the world at Ragnarok, that kind of thing is very much the victory of chaos over order. And that's exactly what happened in that book. But now there's a complete shift that happened in this book, because the definite end of the world is produced or aimed for by the auditors, who are in fact, the personification of rules, of law, of order. So where chaos was the enemy in that earlier book, now order is the enemy. And I think there lies something deeply important in that goes back to Terry Pratchett's evolution as a writer, Terry Pratchett's politics, our politics, and so forth. And I think that's... See, politics are very often difficult to explain because at the end of the day, extremes are never really good. Now, I personally believe in extreme actions where they are warranted and all of that kind of stuff, but at the end of the day, the goal is always some form of compromise, which doesn't sell well. But that's sort of where Pratchett ends up as well, in a compromise between law and order. That's basically what humanity, at the end of the day, seems to be, which is, trying to think before we break rules, but break rules where we feel it's important to do so. That's why characters like Susan Stohelit and, on the other hand, Unity, the auditor in this book, are so important, because they both are, in a way, this kind of compromise. The idea between, all these rules that need to be, obeyed, but also knowing when to break them. That thing that goes beyond the mere rules, because the law is, once again, that's mechanics, that's rules, that's hard and fast rules. And there is that feeling, or hope, I guess, in a lot of ways, at least for me, it's a hope. It's the wish that there is more. It's not just mechanics. We have free will. We need to believe that we have free will. We need to be aware, we hope that there is more. And now we can obviously go and ask, why do we hope that? But it's, it's something that is hard to answer, or maybe impossible to answer from a within perspective. And that is sort of what Terry Pratchett is trying to hint at, I feel. Because, the image of the opening the box with the crowbar that is in the box, or having, the clock that measures the universe with a piece that has to be outside of the universe. Those kind of things, those metaphors come up again and again in this book. The idea that you need an outside perspective to have a definite answer, to get at the core. It's exactly what the book starts with this wonderful opening that I absolutely love. It's one of the best that Pratchett has written, which is about the perspective and knowing more and having the outside perspective, because that changes the perception of what you have. When he talks about the story of the Emperor with new clothes, which could also be the story of, the boy that got a deserved thrashing for making fun of royalty, or the story of the guards rounding up everyone who saw the naked emperor and telling them that this didn't happen, okay? Or, all these other things that he goes to. Or the brilliant Titanic joke about the iceberg and all those seals and polar bears that are looking forward to the life in the other hemisphere where the fjords are lined with crunchy penguins. It's one of those things I will never be able to think about penguins without thinking about them being crunchy, which... Thank you, Sir Terry. That's definitely something I needed in my life, but, there you are. So there's all of these elements in here, and I do appreciate the attempt that Pratchett makes here, which is, yes, there is something inexplicable here, and we will never be able to explicate it, because that's kind of the point. That element of chaos is core to life, and it's important to be aware of that and keep it in check, but also allow it its free reign. I mean, hell, even death has the death of rats, who is exactly that for death, who seems to be, beyond that, more or less wrestling with the fact of being a biological function and how that problem, creates problems once you're aware of it, because that's, once again, that's the core question that Terry Pratchett is wrestling with here. And I think he does a good job. In general, he does a good job with that question. And he goes the usual route, which is, making these things, personifying them, making them personable, making them literal in a lot of ways. And that's great. And I feel that's where this book shines. Because in a way that, Pratchett does a lot of times, it shows his style of humor, which is taking metaphors literal, making them as literal as possible, which is in this case, obviously, how we treat with time, which is how he comes up with the idea of the procrastinators and making time stretch longer or shorter, winding them. He literally makes a metaphor. He makes it literal by turning it into a machine, by making it mechanical with, bits and pieces and stuff like that. And it's where both Pratchett's method in general, when he, takes big questions and turns them into fun stories, happens, but it's also very much how humor and absurd humor is created for Terry Pratchett. It's like, hey, look, once you take big ideas and turn them into, something literal, they are kind of ridiculous, but they work because, they work. So maybe sometimes it's better to not look too closely at the mechanics if we want to, be aware and be able of, have fun in life, sort of have a fulfilled life. I think that's the other key moment here, is like accept the perfect moment when it happens, because it's so easy to just, take that away when you question everything, which, is sort of the story that Susan Stohellett has to learn here. It's like, sometimes it's important to give free rein and just take the perfect moment. Then there's, of course, the other stuff that we need to talk about, the more nitty-gritty bits that make this book stand out, or maybe not. Now, I personally have never been a fan of martial arts, or at least, martial arts and discipline, because I'm not a very disciplined kind of person. It rubs me the wrong way. I've also never watched that many martial arts movies, but I do appreciate the way Pratchett uses the way of Mrs. Cosmopolite. There is something we need to talk about here that is certainly in there somewhere, and maybe runs parallel to the idea of order versus chaos, and that's the idea of education versus wisdom. Which is, if you play Dungeons & Dragons, you know that there is intelligence and there is wisdom, and they are very different stats because you have different numbers for them. But that's sort of the point here that comes back with the, discipline teachings of the monastery, and on the other hand, the way of Mrs. Cosmopolite, which are just like sayings, and the idea that sometimes we, like more educated traditionally educated people underestimate sort of the wisdom, that erudition can be very dismissive of wisdom, of wisdom and of experience in a lot of ways, that we can look down on them. And he shows that in all kinds of ways. The danger, of course, is the usual, oh, this goes against good common sense, because that's an argument that is usually deployed, or often deployed these days, by people that that want to, take their personal opinions and force them on everyone. We call them fascists sometimes. So there is that danger, but I feel the idea of, once again, following Terry Pratchett, is like finding a compromise. Looking and thinking about what you do, and learning what is important to learn, knowing these kind of things, and then giving a bit, sort of. Also, looking at experience and never underestimating someone who doesn't have like the same degree on paper. That's definitely an important element, because arrogance is always wrong. And Terry Pratchett is, if there's like one through line through most of what Terry Pratchett does in his books, it is very much attacking the arrogance of people who think they are better or know more than anyone else, but don't. Once again, that's a very, understandable feeling, especially once you read his biography, which is, don't do that if you are a follower of Saint Roland or Bart. But yeah, Terry Pratchett did not like organized school, because he's more on the chaotic side of things, which I personally appreciate in a lot of ways. But it does sometimes come out in these ideas that we tend to underestimate, experience and folk wisdom in a lot of ways. But yeah, the danger is to give them too much credibility as well. Then there is, of course, another element that comes into this that I personally like as a callback to Small Gods. Remember that Small Gods was all about people stopping to worship the god by worshipping the church instead? Well, there is a point in this book where it's very much the same thing, just with the order of the history monks and people having more respect and serving the structure, serving the organization, instead of like serving the purpose of the organization, which I personally appreciate, because it shows that criticism of a structure, of a system, of an organization is not just about religion. It is about every organization. We tend to fall down that hole. And that is exactly, once again, where we come back to the idea of order versus chaos, which is exactly that. Once we follow rules and think rules are the only thing that determines everything, and there's a definite answer, it is very difficult to then, it is very easy to then just like follow that structure and never think outside of the box. But you need to think outside of the box when new issues come up. You need to have that other perspective and be willing to take on that other perspective, which is very much what happens in this book. Now let's talk about one or two other things before we end the whole discussion. Other perspectives. See, there are two characters in this book that become one. I'm talking of Jeremy, the watchmaker, and Lobsang Newgate, the monk. First of all, I love the fact that the thief is called Newgate Ludd, which is, Terry Pratchett used. Have you heard of Newgate Prison? It's exactly where thieves ended up in London. It's a famous prison, is what I'm saying here. So having a thief named after a famous prison is a fun thing to do. I appreciate that. But, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, but there's an interesting aspect here. See, those two characters can be read, and they should be read, I guess, as different versions of what you might call neurodiversity or the likes, where Jeremy, the clockmaker, is or does certainly sometimes read, for an outsider, I guess, as someone further along the autism spectrum than others in a lot of ways. You can read it that way. This is, I feel it's fine, and he's taking medicine or not, and I think there's a layer here that I want to explore for a moment. See, so you can read it at that depiction of that, and he's, taking or not taking the medicine because it makes him feel slow and dull. And those of us who've ever taken, any form of medicine for mental health or neurodiversity things, we can probably sort of empathize with the fact that it kind of feels like dulling our brains in a lot of ways, but sometimes it's also necessary because, otherwise, there are larger problems and questions out there that may actually, lead to... It's a compromise in a lot of ways. On the other hand, you have Lobsang Lud, or Nugay Lud, who you can probably read if you want, or maybe I'm reading too much into that because I sympathize with him in that regard. You can read him as someone on the more like on the ADHD side of things. He gets bored easily because he's very talented. He does all kinds of dumb things because he gets bored just because. He doesn't pay attention when he's bored. These kind of things. You can see that in there. He doesn't get medicine. But what he gets is personal attention of Lu Tse, who we remember from earlier books Small Gods again. And that, I feel, is at the heart of what Terry Pratchett is doing in a lot of ways, and it folds back into how he talks about education with Susan as a teacher as well. And that is that some people, or ideally all of us, but because of the whole rules versus chaos thing, once you fall outside of that corset, of that structure, you need personal attention. See, Lobsang flourishes under Lu Tse. He gets challenged, he does things, and at the end of the day, he's more happy. Whereas, on the other hand, the Clockmakers Guild, because, they're the clockmakers, see, it's built in there again. It's the mechanics, the rules of clockmaking, precision versus, creativity. They try to force Jeremy into that corset by force, and he suffers for it. And I feel that, once again, is sort of where the whole thing ends up. Now, I'm not sure I'm happy with the idea that once those two halves come together, they're like a happy, whatever, perfect being afterwards. But it's fantasy. So I get it. But I feel the more important point is that we need to be able to bend or break the rules to make people flourish after all. And that's a very strong message right there that goes, not only for, neurodiversity, it goes for all kinds of things. And especially for children, when we are still trying to find out whether we belong in the structure or should be allowed to maybe sometimes go outside of the structure. Probably most of us should be sometimes outside of the structure, most of the time inside the structure. Think about the rules before we break them. That's sort of the goal here, I guess. And once again, I think that's powerful. I appreciate Pratchett dealing with all of that. Looking at neurodiversity when this book came out in the early 2000s, once again, pretty good. You can probably read some echo of the whole having ADHD or neurodiverse people taking all kinds of medicine. That was very powerful in the 90s, so I guess there's that element to it, which I can see as an inspiration. But, once again, I feel very happy about the fact that he does kind of fold all of these things into the whole question of finding a compromise between free will and rules, between chaos and order, and trying to find a compromise and accepting the fact that chaos is important, that it's not just rules, it's not just mechanics. I appreciate that a lot. So, why doesn't it fully work? I feel like the two plot lines don't fully mesh. Sometimes I feel this book in particular, he's over-exaggerating. While I do love the idea of the weird carpet butter toast scene at the beginning, it's maybe a bit too overdone for my taste, in a way. It harkens back to very early Pratchett, to very, as I said, first 5 books kind of Discworld, which I personally love. But we've moved beyond that. We're now in very serious territory. This is, complicated, convoluted plot lines that come together, ideally, or maybe not fully in this one, that move in, the jokes that are a bit too slapstick-like don't land as much because the tone is more serious, I feel. So I think that's a large issue here. In a way, it feels, and that brings me back to that thing that I said earlier, right? It feels like Terry Pratchett went back and took out a bunch of ideas that he had played with before, and sticking them all together. Things that he looked at for a moment. That's why he picks up the history monks again from Small Gods. That's why he, brings up all these other elements. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. You wanted to say something and you had a bunch of stuff lying around, but it doesn't fully mesh. It's just like after that first time the clock broke and the history monks stitched things together. And most people won't notice. Most people won't notice if, there's the wrong armor in the wrong century and stuff like that. But some people will. And maybe I've read it too many times, but I do. At this point, I'm like, yeah, some bits just don't fully fit. And that's why I don't rank it as, like, one of my favorite Discworld novels. But I do appreciate Terry Pratchett, once again, caring about important themes and important issues, and then making some James Bond-like Q jokes and other stuff of the sort as well. I do appreciate all of that. I just feel that it could have been, more smooth in some regards. Anyway, that's my thoughts on Thief of Time. I hope you enjoyed the book. I did. Just not as much as I hoped to. And let me know what you think about it. And all these other things. I don't know, like, subscribe, do those things. Follow the rules here, because it helps me. Join the Patreon if you feel like it. Join the discussion for the next Discworld novel if you feel like it. Beyond that, have a great day, and thanks for watching. Cheers.